Welcome to this year's final Primate Conversation seminar. We'll introduce our guests in just a minute, but first I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us virtually throughout this past year. The silver lining of having to go remote has been that we've been able to welcome both speakers and audience members from all over the world, which has been really exciting for us. I also wanted to say a big thank you to the lab members that have been organizing these seminars. So that this year that's been Sophie Verdugo, Elodie Freeman, Alex Milka, Alejandro Pascual Garrido, and Caroline Phillips. We'd also like to say thank you to Kate Atherton in our department for assisting with advertising. So today we're very excited to welcome Dr. Shahrina Chowdhury as our final speaker this term. Dr. Chowdhury is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, and doctoral faculty for the anthropology program at the Graduate Center of City University of New York. She's additionally a core faculty member for the New York Consortium in Evolutionary Primatology. On top of all of this, she also became associate director of the Philoha Hamadryas project in Ethiopia in 2018. Much of her more recent work focuses on the interaction of physiological, environmental, and social stressors on baboon behavior, and she's currently setting up an endocrine lab at Brooklyn College. She has secured a number of impressive fellowships, including but not limited to a National Science Foundation doctoral dissertation grant, the Leakey Foundation research grant, and several fellowships from City University of New York. While her more recent work has focused on various baboon species, she has also done research involving blue monkeys, howler monkeys, silvered langurs, humans, and even bats. We're very excited to hear her talk and encourage audience members to contribute questions through our YouTube live chat. Thank you so much, Shahrina, for speaking with us today, and I pass over the floor to you.
Thank you, Yana, for that lovely introduction. Let me first share my screen. So is this okay? Does everyone see? Do you guys see?
Yep, we can see.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this to give a talk in this seminar series, and also thank you to everyone who is attending or listening to my talk today. So I'm going to talk to you today about physiological challenges for baboons that live in anthropogenic landscapes. Let me start by giving a background. My slide is not advancing. Let me see. That's weird. Okay. So I'm going to give you a quick background about what I'm interested in, what my research interests are. So I study sociality in primates, trying to understand the adaptive benefits of sociality and how variation in social behavior may be explained by ecological factors, and also looking at the physiological basis of behaviors. So I study two species of baboons. I study Hamadryas baboons in Ethiopia. This is the Philoha Hamadryas project. So this is a collaboration with Larissa Swidell at Queens College of the City University of New York. And in this project, we basically look at various questions relating to trying to understand the evolution of this complex multi-level social system. I also study Chacma baboons in the Cape Peninsula of South Africa. So this was research that I did for my PhD dissertation. And for today's talk, I'm going to focus only on the Chacma baboons, and I'm not going to talk about the Hamadryas today. As we know, primates live mostly in tropical areas. And the places where primates are found and where their species richness is high, these are also places where that have high densities of human populations. So due to increasing human encroachment into natural habitats, we see increasingly there tends to be a large amount of spatial overlap between human and non-human primates, with humans and wildlife living in shared and integrated ecological spaces. So with all of these primates living in anthropogenic habitats or habitats that have been altered in some way by humans, we see different effects of this sort of commensalism. Some species actually do well in these altered habitats, especially those that have access to human foods. When primates and humans live in proximity to one another, there is a whole range of interactions that they have, and these range from being mutually beneficial to benign to harmful for one or both species. And often we do see that these interactions end up being harmful for the primate species concerned. As primates increasingly compete with humans in these shared spaces for food as well as resources, and as they become increasingly more dependent on feeding on human sources of food, they increasingly come into contact as well as conflict with humans. So unfortunately, we see oftentimes that these species become victims of their own success, and many oftentimes come to be regarded as pests by people. If we look at the conservation status of some primate species that live in anthropogenic environments, we see that 57% of these species are in IUCN Red List threatened categories, with 29% being endangered and 8% of them being critically endangered. So the point is, many of these species that continue to live in anthropogenic habitats, they are endangered, and continuing to live in these anthropogenic habitats will probably exacerbate some of these conservation threats for them. Another issue that is of increasing importance for primates is human-induced climate change. As extreme weather and climate events become more intense as well as more frequent in recent times, we see weather patterns as well as seasonality shifting outside longstanding norms in many of these primate habitats. Some species may be flexible enough to cope with these changes, but many species probably they can't keep up with the rapid pace of change that some of these places are experiencing, which, as you can imagine, will have negative impact on many aspects of their lives, including their behavior, their physiology, reproduction, and overall survival. In many species, we see that the initial response to these environmental changes, whether they are natural or whether they are human-induced, is some sort of behavioral change. And these behavioral changes can be beneficial because they allow the animals to adapt, and therefore they allow them to survive and persist in the face of environmental change. However, some of these behavioral changes, these changes can be complex, and they can have cascading effects and interactions with other factors, which in turn may affect the evolution as well as the persistence of these species, especially if there is rapid human-induced environmental change happening that produces conditions that a species is not used to in its evolutionary past, and the pace of change is too fast. The behavioral changes may turn out to be maladaptive and reduce the species fitness, affecting their long-term survival. So in essence, it is important for us to understand what the range of potential behavioral responses may be to some of these anthropogenic environmental changes. So I look at both of these factors, the effects of living in anthropogenic habitats and also the effects of climate variability in terms of strong seasonality and how it affects primates, how it affects baboons specifically. So many studies have actually looked at primates living in fragmented or disturbed forests, or primates living in unprotected or human impacted habitats. And what these studies have found is that not only are behaviors impacted in terms of where the animals range, what they eat, their social behaviors, etc., but we also see many negative impacts on their cortisol hormone levels as well, on their physiology. So many of these populations that have been studied that live in disturbed habitats compared to populations that live in undisturbed habitats, the populations in disturbed habitats have been found to have chronically elevated glucocorticoid hormone levels. So in the short term, an increase in glucocorticoid hormones is an adaptive stress response, but exposure to stresses for prolonged periods, when it leads to chronically elevated glucocorticoid levels, that may actually be maladaptive, with negative repercussions on the health and well-being of animals, including reproductive suppression, immune suppression, etc. So in addition to living in anthropogenic habitats, I'm also interested in investigating the effects of environmental stressors such as drought, extremes of hot or cold temperatures can actually impact animals in many ways, including, again, their physiology, their behavior, reproduction, and survival. Climatic factors also affect the availability of food, which in itself can also have additional negative impacts on animals. So as I said, most primates live in the tropics, and so most of these tropical primates don't experience great fluctuations in temperatures. But those that do experience extremes of temperatures, including very low temperatures or very high temperatures, or primates that experience extended periods of drought, they have been found to have chronically elevated glucocorticoid levels. Additionally, many primates experience changes in their behaviors as well as their activities. And some of these behavioral changes may actually serve as behavioral thermoregulation, while some behavioral changes may actually be in response to the effects of seasonality on the availability of food. In response to these climatic changes or temperature changes, we know that endotherms have physiological mechanisms for maintaining their body temperature within an optimal range in order to maintain their homeostasis. But in addition to physiological mechanisms, animals are known to use behavioral mechanisms as well to thermoregulate. Some behavioral mechanisms of thermoregulation used by primates include things like changing the use of microhabitats. So, for example, animals may actually actively search for areas where the environmental conditions, such as temperature, are more suitable for their comfort and fall within their range of temperatures that's within their thermoneutral zone. So basically, for example, seeking out shaded areas in hot weather or seeking out sunny open areas in cold weather. Animals also oftentimes change their activities as a way to thermoregulate. So changing activities, for example, to minimize energy expenditure at higher temperatures and to conserve heat or raise their body temperature in colder ambient temperatures. Another way to thermoregulate, behavioral mechanism for thermoregulation, is changing body postures. Body postures relate directly to the amount of surface area that is exposed to the environment, and some postures are better for absorbing heat and some postures are better for losing heat. And finally, another way in which primates behaviorally thermoregulate, is by changing proximity between individuals. So for example, in cold temperatures, they might huddle together in order to not lose heat. So I looked at the effects of both anthropogenic stressors as well as climatic stressors on the stress physiology of Chacma baboons. So basically looking at whether living in proximity to humans and whether extreme differences in climatic factors between seasons affects their physiology as well as their behavior. And in terms of looking at their behavioral responses, one of the things I was interested in figuring out is whether these behavioral changes that these baboons go through may in fact be coping mechanisms that they are using in order to mitigate some of these, the effects of some of these stressors that they experience. So to give you a background on the baboons, and specifically I'll move on to Chacma baboons. So there are 6 species of baboons distributed all over sub-Saharan Africa, and Chacma baboons are found all over Southern Africa. So I studied the Chacma baboons specifically that reside in the Cape Peninsula of South Africa. And these baboons in the Cape Peninsula are rather famous, or I should say notorious, They receive a lot of media attention, and the reason why I point this out is to basically highlight to you the kind of divergent, dichotomous, and extreme or strong views and opinions that people have about the baboons, the people who live around the baboons. So people either love them or hate them, and this obviously has implications for the baboons there. There are several unique aspects about this population, and I wanted to give you a quick overview of that. First, the climate there is very different from the tropical climates that most primates are adapted to. The Cape Peninsula has summers that are hot, they're dry, with very long days. And winters are not only cold, but they're wet. It's the rainy season, so the winter is the rainy season in the Cape Peninsula, and the days are much shorter. So very different from tropical areas where there's not seasonal variation in day length. So in the Cape Peninsula, winter days can be shorter than summer days by up to 4.5 hours, which also means that the baboons have 4.5 fewer hours on a winter day to complete all of their activities. Most of the baboon groups that live in the Cape Peninsula are found in close proximity to humans. Most of them range in these mosaic habitats that are composed of both protected areas, national park areas, as well as some sort of anthropogenic habitat. So what this means is that the baboons in most of these groups do come into a lot of contact with people. They have interactions with people, and a lot of these interactions are often of a conflict nature. So because of this high level of contact between baboons and humans, the population, the groups in the Cape Peninsula is a managed one, meaning the city of Cape Town makes management decisions when necessary about the baboons' welfare. Also, they employ people, baboon monitors, to follow the baboons around to keep them away from human inhabited areas. And lastly, one last thing I wanted to point out about my groups in particular is that there was a lot of deforestation going on during the course of my study, which also led to the baboon-human conflict because it led to increased interactions, increased contact between baboons and humans. So as you can see, all of these unique aspects of the Cape Peninsula end up posing many potential challenges for the baboons, which is what I was interested in investigating. So I looked at anthropogenic stressors by looking at the time spent ranging in the different types of habitats in anthropogenic habitats versus more protected areas. So how this impacted the baboons. So when they range in anthropogenic habitats, they also have more interactions with humans, and whether this had any effect on their physiology in terms of their cortisol hormone levels, and also whether it had any impact on their behaviors. And then also I looked at the effect of climatic factors, environmental factors, by looking to see if seasonal differences in temperature, day length, and rainfall was associated with changes in the cortisol levels as well as the behaviors of the baboons, and also looking to see if some of these behavioral changes that they went through might in fact be mechanisms for thermoregulation, behavioral thermoregulation. So there are in total 16 groups of Chacma baboons located throughout the peninsula, Cape Peninsula. There are 12 troops of baboons in the southern peninsula and 4 troops in the northern peninsula in the Tokai section of Table Mountain National Park. And so in my study, I looked at, I studied 3 of the 4 troops that live in the northern peninsula. So this is the composition of my 3 study groups, the largest group MT1, the medium-sized group MT2, and the smallest group JT. And in the study, I focused on all of the adult females in each of the 3 groups, meaning I collected all of the behavioral data as well as the hormone samples, fecal samples for hormone analysis from all of the females, all of the adult females in each of the 3 groups. So in terms of data collection in the field, we did collected behavioral data as well as demographic data and climatic data, and my climate data are supplemented. The rainfall data come from the South African Weather Service. For the hormone analysis, I collected fecal samples from, as I said, all of the females in the 3 troops, and I brought them back to the US and analyzed them at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, where I did radioimmunoassays to quantify the levels of glucocorticoids. And in the field, I was able to collect data on 3 troops simultaneously because I had the help of 3 field assistants, and big shout out to all of them. And I am very grateful to all 3 of them for their contribution, for their really large contribution to my research. So before I go into the data and the results, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the different types of habitats that the baboons used in this study and some of the implications of that. So as you can see here, broadly, there are 3 types of habitats that all 3 troops of baboons use. So on the slopes of the mountains is the protected area, the national park, which during my study consisted mostly of forest, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then in the low-lying areas, outside of the national park, is a very affluent suburb of Cape Town. And then in the northern slopes, on the northern slopes of the mountains and going down into the low-lying areas, there's agricultural land, vineyards basically, that grow, several vineyards that grow grapes for wine production. So these are kind of the approximate home ranges of the 3 troops. As you can see, they have separate but partially overlapping ranges. This is the home range of the largest troop, MT1, the home range of the medium-sized troop, MT2, and the smallest troop, JT. And again, all 3 troops used all 3 types of habitats, but to different degrees. Okay, so I wanted to explain each of those 3 habitats very quickly. The baboons lived historically mainly in Tokai Forest, which is a plantation within Table Mountain National Park. The plantation consisted mostly of pine forest, as well as to a large extent of eucalyptus forest. And there's also indigenous fynbos in parts of the park and some very small patches of forest with indigenous trees. But because this was a human-made plantation, the national park made the decision to clear the forest so that the indigenous fynbos could regenerate. So very intensive logging started during my study and continued for months during my study. What I should also mention is that Tokai Forest is open to recreational users. So there are usually bikers as well as hikers who frequent different parts of the forest. So the 3 troops that occupy different range in different parts of the national park or different parts of the forest, they each had different levels and types of contact with people while they ranged in the forest. The logging that occurred during the study had several implications for the baboons. The process, as you can imagine, was very disruptive for the baboons with all the chainsaws and aggressive interactions with the loggers. But the kind of long-term impacts for the baboons were that they lost many important sleeping sites. So the pine trees were in Tokai Forest. There were different stands of pine trees that were very important sleeping sites for the baboons. And the baboons also consumed pine cones, especially in certain seasons. So basically what this means is that they lost sleeping sites, they lost foraging ground, they lost large parts of their home ranges. So what this means is that they started ranging more in the suburbs and raiding in the suburbs more frequently. And there was one troop that actually started using trees in somebody's garden as a sleeping site. So increasingly, the baboons spent time outside of the national park and in the adjacent suburban areas. And as you can see in the suburbs, there were different types of spaces where they could range, including grassy meadows, picnic sites, horse farms and horse stables, as well as people's houses and gardens where the fruit trees were a big attraction for the baboons. In the suburbs, the baboons also came into conflict with people. They often received aggression from people as well as their domestic animals. Dogs belonging to the residents often chased the baboons, and the baboons and the dogs would attack each other on occasion, which sometimes led to injuries for one or both parties. And the people in the suburbs used different methods to chase the baboons away. They used shotguns, air guns, paintball guns, threw stones at them. They used banging devices and chased the baboons. So all of these interactions in the suburbs, as you can imagine, were potentially a significant source of stress for the baboons. Additionally, in the suburbs, the baboons were followed by monitors who, as I mentioned earlier, were employed to keep the baboons away from roads, from the houses, basically to try to keep the baboons inside the national park. And so the monitors often heard of the baboons shouting at them, chasing them, throwing stones at them, things like that. So they basically tried to restrict the baboons' movement and affected their ranging. And the presence of the monitors was also a source of stress, possibly a source of stress for the baboons. And finally, the vineyards that were adjacent to the national park to the north of the national park. These were also an important ranging ground for the baboons. They spent a significant amount of time ranging in the different vineyards, and they were attracted to these vineyards for various foods that they could get there, not just the grapes, but also, for example, grain that was planted between the vine rows, fruits in the gardens of workers' houses, food at the wine estate restaurants. So the vineyards were quite problematic as well year-round. The vineyards actually constructed an electric fence to try to keep the baboons out, but as you can see here, the baboons are lined up waiting to try to get in, and they do find ways of getting in. So the vineyards were not necessarily, the electric fence was not necessarily entirely successful in keeping the baboons out of the vineyards. So despite the attraction of the food in the vineyards, there are also costs associated with ranging in the vineyards. There's a big electric transformer that led to electrocution and injuries for some of the baboons. So injuries as well as mortality, actually. Several baboons died after being electrocuted at this transformer. Also in the vineyard, you have the issue that vineyard workers are also very aggressive towards the baboons because they want to try to keep them away from the crops. So they also use paintball guns, real guns, throw stones at them, use loud sounds, etc., to try to keep them out. So those are the three types of habitats. And again, all of the three troops used all these different types of habitats, vineyards, suburbs, and national park, but to varying extents. And so they had different levels as well as type of contact with people when ranging in these different habitats. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some of the data, and the data I present to you, sometimes they're from the largest troop, the MT1 troop, and sometimes they are data from all of the three different troops combined, and I will point out to you when I'm showing what. So first, looking at anthropogenic stressors, what the impact of ranging in these different types of habitats meant for baboon physiology as well as behavior. So these are data from the largest study troop, MT1. And the way I looked at it is a little bit different from what other studies do that typically compare a group living in a disturbed habitat with a group that lives in an undisturbed habitat. So instead of comparing different groups, I looked at it within a group and basically looked at how amount of time spent ranging in one specific habitat is associated with physiological and behavioral changes. So here you see the amount of time, the percent time spent ranging in each of 4 different habitat types by the troop empty ones. So here I included I did a little bit more finer grained analysis and included a 4th category for habitat in addition to the 3 I already mentioned. So in addition to national park, suburb, and vineyard, I included mixed areas. So these mixed areas were basically patches of forest found within the suburban areas. So basically what this shows is that the troop MT1 spent most of its time ranging. It spent more than 80% of its time ranging in anthropogenic habitats, including suburb, mixed areas, and vineyards. So it spent less than 20% of its time ranging in the protected areas in the national park. So what does this mean for their cortisol levels? So here you see variation in monthly variation in cortisol level, and also monthly variation in time spent ranging in each of 4 habitat types. So in both of these figures, the bars show the cortisol levels, the females average monthly cortisol level, and then in the top panel you have ranging in national park given by the solid line, and then the dotted line shows monthly percentage of time ranging in the suburbs, and in the bottom figure you have monthly percentage of time ranging in mixed areas shown by the solid line, and monthly percentage of time ranging in vineyards by the dotted line. So basically what I found is that when the baboons spent more time ranging in the suburbs, they had, the females had higher cortisol levels. Similarly, in the months when they spent more time ranging in the vineyards, the females also had higher cortisol levels. But when they spent more time in a month ranging in the national park, the females had lower GC, lower cortisol levels. So basically, when the baboons spent more time in a month ranging in anthropogenic habitats, they had higher GC levels, and in months when they spent more time in protected areas, they had lower cortisol levels. I also looked at differences in their activity budgets when ranging in the different habitats. And basically what this shows is that when the baboons spent time ranging in all of the anthropogenic environments, including suburbs, vineyards, and mixed areas, they spent more time feeding and less time socializing and resting. And the opposite was true in the national park. When they spent time in the national park, they spent less time feeding and more time socializing and resting. So these results are actually a little bit different from what other studies have found, that feeding time actually decreases in urban environments. But why the baboons in this study spent more time feeding in urban environments is not very clear. This may have to do with reduced feeding efficiency, which may result from the fact that they spend more time in vigilance behaviors when they are ranging in the anthropogenic environments, or it could simply be that the baboons are actually consuming foods beyond their caloric requirements simply because they have access to it in the more anthropogenic environments. Additionally, the fact that they socialized less in these anthropogenic habitats is noteworthy, I think, and potentially also problematic for the baboons, because maintaining social relationships and social bonds is extremely important to these highly social female baboons. So it appears that there may be costs associated with spending time in proximity to humans, and it may be challenging for the females because we see differences in activity budgets as well as in their cortisol levels, depending on whether they range in anthropogenic or non-anthropogenic environments. Next, moving on to how climatic stressors may impact their cortisol as well as their behavior. I looked at how monthly cortisol varies with climatic factors, specifically temperature, rainfall, and day length. And again, these are now data combining all three troops. So before I was showing data from only the largest troop, MT1, and now these are data from all of the three troops combined. And so basically what I found is that cortisol was higher in months when the day length was shorter, temperature was lower, and rainfall was higher. And looking at 5 different predictors of cortisol levels, climatic predictors, day length, mean temperature, maximum temperature, minimum temperature, and rainfall, I found that day length was actually the most significant predictor of cortisol levels. And as I mentioned earlier, day length is dramatically reduced in the winter compared to the summer months. So in addition to looking at monthly variation, I also looked at seasonal differences. So looked at differences between summer and winter, summer being the months December, January, and February, and winter being the months June, July, and August. And again, I found that in winter, the females had higher GCs compared to the summer season. And then looking at how activity budgets may be different between seasons, we see that there were some differences in some of their activities between winter and summer. So in winter, we see that the females spent less time socializing, as well as resting, as well as moving. So it looks like that the shorter winter days in the Cape Peninsula impose constraints as well as limitations on the activities of these baboons. The females didn't change their overall amount of time feeding that they spent feeding between the seasons. So it seems that to maintain their feeding time, and given that they had about 4.5 fewer hours on a winter day to complete all of their daily activities, they basically had to reduce the amount of time that they spent on all other activities. And again, here, the reduction in social time in winter is important to consider given the importance of social bonds to female baboons and the potential negative impacts of that. Because seasonal differences in the availability of food may require more foraging time, I also looked at differences in time spent eating versus time spent foraging between the seasons by the females of each troop. And here we found that the females spent less time foraging in the winter in both of the larger troops, the MT1 and MT2 troop. And another important difference that I want to mention is that the medium-sized troop, MT2, experienced an increase in time spent eating from summer to winter. MT2 is also the troop that had the least access to anthropogenic foods. So this is potentially a cost for them that they experience as a result of ranging less in anthropogenic environments and having to spend more time eating foods that may not be as calorically rich as those eaten by the other two troops. So to summarize, it seems that winter is a challenging time for the baboons because in winter, the females have higher cortisol and they have less time to conduct their non-sustenance activities. And very quickly, finally, I wanted to show you quickly some data relating to behavioral thermoregulation. As I mentioned earlier, one of the ways in which animals may thermoregulate behaviorally is by changing their use of microhabitats. So at higher temperatures, animals often use shaded space more, and conversely, at lower temperatures, they may be in more open habitats for greater sun exposure and warmth. So all of these data, again, are from the largest troop, the MT1 troop. So as you can see here, the troop MT1 spent more time in deforested areas, in open, cleared areas where they had more sun exposure in the winter season compared to the summer season. And conversely, they spent about 5 times as much time within the forest in shaded areas in the summer months compared to the winter months. Another way to thermoregulate is by changing postures and positional behaviors. In hotter temperatures, primates use more open and sitting postures with their limbs extended to in order to be able to lose more heat. So to assess this, whether they are doing similar things, I looked to see if there were differences in time spent lying around between the seasons. So one would expect that they would spend more time lying around in the hotter months compared to the colder months, which is exactly what I found. There were differences between the seasons with the baboons lying around more in summer compared to winter. And lastly, I looked at proximity as a mechanism for thermoregulation. In cold conditions, animals huddle or maintain closer proximity overall for warmth. So I looked at the time spent in bodily contact, but I actually didn't find any differences really between the different seasons. So it looks like they didn't spend more time in bodily contact in the winter, which we would expect if they were actually changing proximity in order to thermoregulate. Another thing I looked at is group cohesion, social cohesion, and I don't want to make too much of this, but just as an indicator. So this basically shows how cohesive versus how spread out the individuals of the group might be. So how many individuals are near each other versus being more spread out. So we see that in winter, the baboons maintain greater cohesion as a group with a greater number of individuals within closer proximity to one another compared to the summer months. So some indication that some thermoregulation is going on. So putting it all together, we see that in response to both anthropogenic and climatic stressors, the baboons experience changes in their cortisol levels as well as in their behavior in response to anthropogenic stressors in terms of ranging. When the baboons ranged in more anthropogenic environments, the females had higher cortisol and also experienced changes in their activity budgets. In terms of environmental stressors, we see that the winter season with three different conditions happening simultaneously, meaning cold temperatures, then high rainfall, as well as shorter day length, all of these three things happening together simultaneously is probably physiologically stressful for the baboons, because in winter the baboons had, the females had higher cortisol. And we also see some differences in behavior as well, and some indication that the baboons may be actively thermoregulating in each season as a way to offset some of these costs. So they may be using methods such as spending more time in open areas and maintaining greater cohesion as a group in winter, and conversely, spending more time in shaded forests and lying around more in the summer months. So, which may in fact have contributed to them not experiencing increases in their cortisol levels in the summer months, which we might have predicted as well, because summers can also be potentially difficult for the baboons, because not only is it hot, but it's also the dry season. And the Cape Peninsula actually in recent years has been experiencing really bad droughts, prolonged droughts with wildfires, etc. So it is increasingly, summer season is increasingly becoming more and more challenging for the baboons in the peninsula. So thinking about all of this more broadly, these results may have important implications in a world that is experiencing rapid human-induced environmental and climate change. In response to all of the different types of stressors, both anthropogenic and environmental stressors, the female baboons altered their behaviors in this study. Some of these behavioral changes may have been beneficial in terms of allowing the baboons to cope with these changes. And behavioral flexibility has been suggested to be one of the most crucial factors that will enable species to survive in the climate change. So this flexibility is important, and the flexibility exhibited by the baboons in this case is actually important and perhaps helps them to adapt and cope. What is significant about these results is that baboons are considered to be very adaptable and flexible species. And if even they are exhibiting negative impacts, negative effects, then the consequences of these environmental changes may be much worse for other animals that are not as easily adaptable. So with that, I would like to first thank all of you who attended and who paid attention for the last, I don't know how many minutes. And also I would like to thank everyone who has been involved in this research, everyone who has helped me do this research, people at my university, people in Cape Town, people at the Smithsonian, my funding agencies, and most importantly, I would really like to thank all 3 of my field assistants who helped me collect these data. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shahrina. That was just such a fantastic talk. I know we're all giving you a virtual round of applause from far away today. That was so amazing, covering so many interesting and really relevant topics to lots of us here. We have so many questions. Everyone loves baboons here. So I'd better get started and we'll get through as many as we can. Just to
Should
pick
I
up
stop sharing?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I guess you can if that's okay. Not super important. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so the first one, I guess, just picking up on what you were talking about at the end there, about baboons, being known as particularly flexible. I was wondering if you have any insights into kind of other primate species, how they respond to maybe similar challenges, and yeah, whether you got the sense that these baboons are really good at adapting to the environments you describe.
So other species. Well, you have other generalist species like macaques, for example, right? Who kind of go through similar things. So they also are able to kind of live in these human modified habitats. They live in cities, they live in urban settings, and they thrive to some extent. But the question is, how long can they thrive, right? At what point does it become too problematic in terms of, we're looking at living in anthropogenic habitats, but in terms of looking at other environmental changes, if we look at these climatic factors, if we look at seasonal differences, the reason why I was interested in looking at these baboons as a model is because so the difference in the seasonality is relatively normal for them, right? They live in the Cape Peninsula, they're used to these. But it was a way to try to understand when you do have these big differences in seasons, which most other primates don't experience, what is happening to these generalist species? How are they reacting? How are they coping, if they are coping at all? And the fact that there are these differences we found in between the seasons, I think it is problematic and indicative of potential. I mean, if the droughts get worse, which it is in the peninsula, right? Mm-hmm. The wildfires that are happening, right, as a result of the droughts. So that's a different story. And to be honest, in Tokai, a few years ago, there was a big wildfire that destroyed large portions of the habitats of these baboons. So these problems are getting worse, and it's hard to say how species will react. A lot of them, especially the specialist species, right, may not do so well, probably will not do so well.
Yeah. Thank you. I guess maybe linking on to that then, I also asked this question. I was wondering, so you talk about all these different challenges, and there's various things you talked about, logging and wildfires and things, and I wondered whether you noticed differences in the response, whether when the challenges were sort of very sudden versus kind of challenges that might progress over time, like temperatures increasing slowly, things like that. Do you notice kind of differences in the timeline of their response?
I mean, there are some responses that are evident, that are, you see right away. So things like logging, right? Because it's happening suddenly. They're suddenly losing sleeping sites. They're losing trees that provided them with food. So they're going to shift their ranging and go elsewhere to look for food. They're going to find other sleeping sites. So those are things that are more obvious right away. But in terms of one of the things I was also interested in understanding was these subtle differences in the types of human interactions that they have. So for example, if they're used to the hikers and bikers, right? They live in the forest, hikers and bikers regularly use them. It's not a kind of aggressive interaction that they have with them. Are they habituated to that kind of interaction versus new stressors that they are obviously not habituated to, that are more kind of short-term things that happen. So the responses will be different, right? And how they shift their behaviors and whether they are able to cope with them or not.
Great, that's really interesting. A slightly different question now. Someone has asked if, well, they note that in areas with pine plantations, baboons have often been reported to bark strip or chew, and they were wondering if it was something you saw in the remnants of the pine plantations, and if you think there's a specific new forage type that this might be replaced by.
So they do do bark stripping, and but it's not necessarily. I mean, in the groups that I studied, it wasn't extremely common. It happened. I saw them doing it. It happened often enough that you notice it, but it is not something. It is not a large proportion of their foraging or their diet, and that may have to do with the fact that they have so many other sources of food. The effort of stripping the bark to get the food is may not be as worth it for them for these groups, for this population in particular, as it may be for other groups that are more dependent exclusively on pines.
Great, thank you. And the last one for this section is someone says, do the baboons face predation pressure other than humans in this area? And if not, do you think that the trends we see in these kind of anthropogenic habitats might be similar to areas with predators, top-level predators and big cats and things?
No, there aren't any large predators, and there aren't any predators around besides humans. And honestly, there's not supposed to be human predation here in the Cape Peninsula, because the Cape Peninsula population is the only population that has some sort of protected status. So there are fines and no other punishment, I think, for people who may try to hurt the baboons, but I don't know how well instituted those fines are. So it's mostly human predation that's a problem here. Sorry, would you mind repeating the second part of the question?
Yeah, sure. They wondered if the sort of trends you see were similar to other groups where they do have predation from maybe big cats or top kind of level predators.
I can imagine that it would be different to some extent when they have other predators to worry about, or a different type of predation to worry about. And in terms of when those predators might be active, whatever, I can imagine that would contribute to differences in how the baboons respond. And in a way, the humans are a constant source of threat, right, here. But it doesn't necessarily also, certain predators might actually dissuade the baboons from going to certain parts of a habitat maybe, but here, even though the humans are a threat to them, it doesn't seem to stop them from attempting to spend time in these places where the humans are going to use aggressive tactics to chase them away.
Yes, very true. Great. Okay, we've got a few questions that are sort of on kind of behavior and social behavior and things. So the first one of these says, are there any behavioral indicators of increased stress that match the physiological data, i.e. more aggression when they range in the suburbs?
So I did look at that, and I also looked at a little bit at aggression and also a little bit at self-directed behaviors. And with the self-directed behaviors, it was a little bit difficult to try to figure out what it meant. And with the aggression, sorry,
I don't know what that was.
Oh, no, so that wasn't me, I don't think. Okay, with the aggression, I looked at that to see how aggression differed when they were ranging in the suburbs versus in the national parks, and there was more aggression within the troop that the females received or gave when they spent more, when they were ranging in the suburbs compared to the national parks. So yeah, there are some behavioral indications of that kind of stress as well. But again, as I said, with the subdirected behaviors, there were some of the subdirected behaviors showed that, you know, yes, these are behaviors that are occurring more, that are anxiety maybe driven behaviors, and sometimes it wasn't.
So someone has asked a question that I think follows on a bit from that. It said, do you think aggression between females or males increases during feeding in the suburban habitat due to food competition?
Aggression between males and females?
It says females or males, but I guess, yeah, asking about whether it's down to the food competition driving aggression.
Well, there's definitely, you know, these are, you know, sometimes they'll come to a big waste site, right? Like a big, what are they called? Garbage dumpsters or whatever, right? Where there's all this trash. But there's not, it's surprising, there's not necessarily always or often too much overt competition necessarily. You do see fighting. You do see fighting. You see fighting in a similar way to what you see in other places as well. So over food. So there is that. But a lot of times it's funny because you do see only, for example, one of the males sitting at this food source, right? And everybody else kind of waiting for their turn and not necessarily challenging the male to access the food. So there's some, but not necessarily as much as one might expect.
That's really interesting. We have another question here about the different troops. Someone says, do you see overlap between troops, and do the intergroup interactions change across the seasons that you describe?
There is overlap between the troops. They come together, and it's very, so one thing I should point out here before I answer the question. So back before 2006, until about 2006, middle of 2006, there was one main large troop in this area in Tokai. And in 2006, they started splitting up. They split up and they split up further. So from one troop, we have 4, right? So basically, point is, they are relatively closely related to one another, right? So when they come together, when they do have intergroup interactions, it varies. It varies, and I don't necessarily know what causes the variation necessarily, because, for example, even when, so when it's harvest time at the vineyards, the baboons, all 3 of the troops try to access the vineyards. And that's a time also when we'll see a lot of spatial overlap between the baboons. So all 3 of them in the vineyards, but in different parts maybe, next to one another. All 3 of them kind of spread out next to each other on the boundaries of the vineyards, waiting to get in. And how they will respond to these intergroup interactions varies. They might mix peacefully, they might fight. And a lot of times when they do fight, it also has to do with the number of females that are actually cycling in the group at that time, right? So the males will fight with one another when there are enough estrus females to protect. But it's variable how they come together and how they react.
Great. We have a few questions. Let's see if we have time to get through on the sort of human-primate conflict theme. Someone has asked, are there any human development projects that work in tandem with the baboon research to tackle the conflicts with humans?
Human-related projects.
Yeah, to tackle human primate conflict.
Well, there's yes, in Cape Town, there are several organizations. There's the Baboon Research Unit from the University of Cape Town. There are other kind of nonprofit organizations that kind of try to address those issues. So, you know, do things from educating the public, going to schools, going to different neighborhoods to talk to people about baboon-human interactions and baboon-human conflict and what it means, how to deal with the baboons, how what are the things not to do, for example, but does it always work? That's the question. So for example, technically, the suburbs that I just mentioned, where the baboons range, right next to the national park, technically they shouldn't be planting fruit trees in their garden, right? They shouldn't be having compost lying around outside. But these are all the things that actually attract the baboons, and we see all of that still there. It hasn't, it's not like people have stopped planting fruit trees. It's not like people stop having compost outside. So
yeah, interesting how successful is the programs. So I guess, yeah, linking just to what you said about crops and things there, someone has asked, do any of the vineyards consider planting sacrificial crops, specifically to divert the baboons? So they say this is something we do in gardening, where you plant something cheap for slugs away from what you're actually trying to grow. So is that a tactic that you've seen used or not?
The vineyard, the vineyards have they have those grains that I mentioned that they plant between but that's not for the baboons, even though the baboons consume them. But that's for other purposes. They plant these barley between the grains between the rows of vines, right? But they also have lots of other things. So they haven't necessarily done it. They hadn't done it during my time. Planting sacrificial crops to attract baboons per se, but there was kind of this study done on another group in the peninsula where they used this kind of artificial patch to see if it would prevent the baboons from raiding in the suburbs, right? And the results were kind of mixed. So there were other things that needed to happen to basically draw the baboons away from, prevent them from raiding in the suburbs. So, I mean, the vineyards have tried so many things with the fences and electric fences and, having people stand in a row during harvest time, but it's still so attractive to them. I've seen the baboons, for example, lining up on the boundaries and actually just sitting there just watching. There might be one person that they see in the vineyard, but they know that if they go in, that one person will come and chase them away, but they are waiting for that one person to go away. They'll wait for long periods of time where they're doing nothing. They're sacrificing on other types of foraging during that time. They're just sitting and watching. And as soon as the person goes away, they'll start trying to go in.
That's really interesting. And it's just great to hear these insights from you, sort of directly watching these things. I think we've got time for maybe two more. One is, someone says, do you see any differences in opportunities for social learning in these different habitats? For example, exploiting novel food resources in the anthropogenic habitats?
That's an interesting question. And there is potential, I think, but I'm trying to think of me having experienced during my time any sort of like a novel learning or a novel variation of something. There's some indication, they do certain things, right, to access things. So for example, this is not about foraging, but one of the males in one of the troops would take a stick and scratch his back using that stick, right? And he was the only one who did that several times, and a few other small things. But the thing is, like, are these things that are spreading through the group? Is this just behavior that is the few things that we may have observed? Are these behaviors that are restricted to that one single individual? Honestly, I don't necessarily see a lot of things that are happening that are novel, that are necessarily being learned throughout the group.
That's really interesting. I like the scratching story. I've got one final question then, quite a good one to end, I think. From the key messages that you've presented today, what do you feel really needs to be considered for future conservation plans for each of the troops in the human-primate interface?
That's a difficult question. What needs to happen? Well, I think studies like this, first of all, the research is important, right? Conservation is a difficult arena. We know that if you look at the effectiveness of different conservation strategies, we see variable results of different conservation measures that have been taken worldwide for things. I mean, in situations like this, for example, what can we do? I mean, we are already living in these places with these animals, right? And I'm guessing humans are not going to go away, leave these places to make space for them. I mean, prevent some of that from happening where it hasn't happened already, and where it has happened, I think to try to understand what the effects may be in these animals, to take that into consideration when devising conservation strategies. I think that's really important. So there is a lot of research like that is happening, that has been happening, particularly because with the groups, with the population in the Cape Peninsula. And they do provide a good model because of who they are, where they are, what they do, their proximity to people. So I think many of these studies do provide useful results to contribute to devising some of these conservation measures and strategies.
Definitely. Thank you so much again, Shahrina, and for sharing your fascinating research. I know we were all so excited to hear the talk, and everyone's been loving it. So that was just great to hear you speak. And just to wrap up then, I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining, both this term and for the academic year. This is actually, we've been told, our 75th Primate Conversation, which is very exciting. And thanks also again, I know Jana thanked them at the beginning, but for the organisers of this series of Primate Conversations, Sophie and Elodie, Alex, Alejandra and Caroline, you've been amazing, and we've had a really great lineup as always. For everyone watching at home, you can catch up on all of our talks in this series on our YouTube channel, and we look forward to welcoming you back in October. We would like you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook page as well for updates about the setup for our October series, and we'll make sure to let you know soon how that will work. But thanks again, Shahrina, and everyone for joining today, and have a good rest of your day.